Okay, my name's Andrew I've got a small property down near Bulladila. We're on a sheep operation there, and I want to sort of talk through a very practical application of landscape hydration. So moving away from ideologies or theories or conceptualisation of what could have been or was, we're sort of more and more deal with what I'm actually facing and what I can do to improve that in a real term. So what I'm going to do is actually drill ours right down into a concepts overview of paddock S5. So even though I'm talking on a small acreage, 100 acres, I'm from bigger farms, but if you'll see in the top central point up there, a blue circle, and that's paddock S5. So we're going to drill down to that specifically in some of the works that I've done over the last 3 to 6 months on that paddock, and look at how we're specifically addressing that from a hydration point of view. And what I'm really wanting to showcase in that, that there's no single silver bullet to landscape hydration. As you're learning today, there's a lot of overlapping concepts that people are talking about, and it's very important to understand that there's different levels of how things may be applicable to your circumstances. This is a plan of my property. I drew up a year ago because I needed to quickly do a presentation, and it has helped my family immensely make some sense of what comes out of my mouth. And you'll see here there's lots of elements of curvature and remnant vegetation identification and different elements of how to tie different parts of the property together into a more whole ecosystem, I suppose. Probably one of my most important points, I believe, is to educate yourself, don't indoctrinate yourself. I think that's one of the real dangers that we have. We can grab a cool concept that we see someone doing something and we try and shoehorn that into our circumstances, not fully aware of whether that's relevant to our circumstance or how much of that may be. We can take concepts of that and apply it, maybe 90%, 10%, or completely ignore it. So I think that's probably the most important aspect, and I've sort of started to list a few things, and each of them certainly have aspects that are very important, but they're not one answer to things. And I think that's the important takeaway that I try and encourage people. Run the crap meter over everything that comes out of my mouth. Work out whether it applies to you or not, and what you're doing. I strongly encourage that. Moving on to next, I'd like to talk about whether earthworks are really needed. I think that's an important place to start with this. Thank you, Jesse. So I think that's an important place to start because it's very easy to go to a quick mechanical fix, whether that's a chain, large ponds, dams, mechanical intervention with deep ripping and ploughing. I think we need to really make a stop and assess whether that's actually necessary or applicable, and because the reality is there's ecological outcomes, financial outcomes, management outcomes that need to be considered when applying earthworks. So this is sort of an aerial shot of our property coming in closer to the up central hill part, one of the highest points of our property that I've focused a lot of the rehydration work in our circumstance. So moving on to swales and diversions. Now, I've just said consider earthworks. I've considered them quite an important aspect to this property. We do have a lot of clay soils, very difficult to get water to infiltrate. If you're getting more major and extreme weather events, a lot of it's going to bounce off. So there's a certain argument, I believe, for small-scale earthworks from a two-pronged attack. It's essentially diverting water, slowing water, focusing nutrient catchment and growth. There's various elements to it. So this property here, you can see I've worked from the highest central point, and that will be a centralised nutrient catchment by making that a night paddock for my sheep. So there'll be an intense location of manure that's on the highest point there that will then distribute across the property. Then an off-contour swale, so that would be a diversion swale. There's lots of different terminologies, but a swale in the context that I refer to, it's just a non-compacted embankment, I suppose, is probably a good way of putting it. So I'm encouraging water infiltration through into that, through percolation and wicking, and also down through the system. So everything's about the process of water's movement rather than sort of physically stopping. Then I come down to the next point, and that's actually an on-contour circle to this paddock. So this outer point here is actually the outside of paddock S5 that I'm referring to. So that was put in place last year when we were promised lots of rain and it never came. But it was in preparation because of the decline of vegetation. Regardless of management practices, it just would not rain. We destocked 12 months ago, about 30 to 50% of our livestock in preparation for what was heading to a very poor summer. I actually just destocked again last week to confuse people for starters, but also because I'm heading into a very good season. So I want to do everything I possibly can to encourage biomass and growth on our property. So I'm taking the hit short term with the livestock side of things to set myself up a lot better long term with the property. We then go into landscape hydration dam. So Paul's much more knowledgeable in dams than I am by far, but this dam here I brought attention to because it's designed to be not 100% effective. Its location was specifically chosen because of some small sense of permeability in the soil structure, and I want it to actually leak to an extent above one of the driest, worst patches of my property, because a lot of the soils here become very hydrophobic after drought periods, and you're going to have a lot of trouble getting water infiltration into that. So I'm doing that over a very slow process. And also, as I'll explain further, the location of that is an ecological link to remnant vegetation on the property. So I'm extending those sort of ecological zones out into the property in sort of fingers and having more edge effect from that. So I bashed that out in a day, so it wasn't quite finished as well as Paul would be used to, but it was a purpose that it served, worked very well going through this winter. So it's actually enabled me to capture and fill through winter quite slowly. It's actually 1.5 meters lower than my main catchment dam on the property. So I actually decant water via gravity and pipe work across to this dam during winter, constantly just via gravity. And then it's actually down a bit lower because I use a firefighter just to push some water and concentrate water onto growth areas in that area within the property. So it's just, these are taken yesterday. So this is what it's looking like now, all these photographs. Thank you, Jessica. Okay, when we talk about non-inversion ploughing, within this paddock here also, so just over the ridge there's that dam to give you some context. Because of our soils, I do try and manage as much vegetation on this property as possible, but have noticed over the couple of years that no matter what you do, there's very limiting factors to root depth and growth in our areas because of the subsoil clay about that far down. So I'm trying to address the more limiting factor of soil oxygen and encouraging root depth as part of that system within that. And then you'll see small trees and different things. So coming off of that dam system, there's actually lines of trees in growth and development in succession as well. So there's a lot of sort of acacias and different things, trying to group protection to courage-on trees and longer term sort of fodder trees and a mixture of different diversity within that. So next, I'd like to talk probably one of my strongest points when you're considering design. Give consideration to your aspect and mitigating against problem elements. One of your a couple of key points here that I work within my property is the summer and winter sun sectors. I'm identifying where that damaging hot sun's going to have its most major effects, how I can plant and design things to mitigate that, where I'm pushing water to. So as I said, this is a good sort of shot from above, but it's showing that top central point on contour, but then the next one being a spiral actually gets me to push more water as it overflows under that hill onto that more western side. So the side of the property that's more likely to dry out from those long hot afternoons, I'm trying to push as much of that water and nutrient around there, and in conjunction with that, pushing that water and potentially highly nutrient laden water away from my aquatic biozone. So you're sort of considering multiple outputs to everything you do. So if anyone follows permaculture, that's one of their favourites, and it's one of mine too. What I'm also looking here for are damaging winds. Wind drives me bananas at my place, and it's probably the major factor that's going to dry out our ecology. One of the downsides to actually having a lot of growth and transpiration through that growth is the humidifying air is obviously a good thing. You're sort of lowering your ambient temperatures through that. But if you've got winds blasting through and ripping that out of your system, you're going to dry out very quickly your subsoil. So you're going to find yourself in a net loss position very quickly if you don't manage that carefully and well. So and that's one of the things. There's a lot of two sides to many positives and negatives within approaches to this type of application. So probably the strong point here and where we've been leading to is starting high in your landscape. That has caveats in that, as Al mentioned, if it's the top of a pointy hill, probably avoid that. But here you're sort of looking in some reasonable level of management structure that can be done that's high in my landscape. And I can have an effect to that. And you can see I'm actually got a better top of the hill than bottom of the hill at this current stage. There's reasons for that. I'm strongly grazing these lower areas, trying to set back some of the grasses that are establishing there. But the effect is hopefully working down through gravity. And the more that we work on the high points of our landscape, the less impact we have decoupling water flow from the watershed as a whole. We're actually having a more minimal effect. We also have less need for major works. And you can manipulate sort of things to a certain direction. So our property heads to the east, as most stuff on this side of the range will do. I'm trying to consistently pushing it back over that way and slowing its journey over our property before it tries to go to the ocean, and working it down through different sort of soils. And you're going to get a lot more impact with that higher in your landscape. That also falls into, as I discussed there, with the gravity potential of stored water. I think it's very important to have water as high in your landscape as you can, because there's a lot of energy required once you've got a big pond down the bottom to do anything with it. And if you've got it higher in your landscape, here, once this dam here overflows, it'll actually overflow around an entire 400 metres on contour swale because of gravity and effect and different elements. It won't go all that way. It'll then start to overflow down there into that next swale, over into a series of embankments down there, fighting the natural flow and gravity of the land across a wider area. Your dams are going to fill up. We're in a very high rainfall area, most of the people that we're going to be here. You're going to get a metre of rain a year probably. It's not going to come in ideal times, and it's not going to come in ideal amounts. So you're trying to sort of enable areas to decant off what Paul was saying. That's one of your important aspects of Earthworks, is enabling that to be spread out and redistributed to some certain extent. So, but the less energy that's required and cost is probably to your benefit, obviously. Rightio, thank you. Jessica will cover much more on biodiversity and things like that. But here I thought was a good example. The dam we've referred to is just behind us there, just out of shot, a couple of tree plantings. But you can see here, I should have brought a sample, it's really awful soil, really. It's not something that's going to really promote agricultural success, I've found. But you can still see within it here, I'm still getting a lot of good growth. And we're in a drying off period, warming up, sort of a period where things are going to be haying off, but I'm still getting a lot of effect drawn out of that winter rainfall and the early spring rainfall we had. I think that's sort of also, if we're working on small areas like that, as I say, where you've talked about what do you do that's approachable? How do you just do something, and what do you do? Small ecotones and strips, your best bang for buck by far. Instead of trying to focus on larger areas, try and get an area that's, as I say, some sort of remnant vegetation and extend that out through an area, or work with different things like that. So you're going to increase that biodiversity very quickly and exponentially relative to your efforts. One of my big things, it's water cycle for a reason. I think there's a lot of stop point thinking. People sort of find one point and stop there. We also all worry about stopping it in the biggest dam we can, or rain's going to be the answer to all of my problems. I'm a big advocate for it's always in motion. So you're trying to work out how to best use that, and being aware of what's additionally being created within that stage through your property. I'm a much bigger fan of transpiration than evaporation. because if something's evaporating out of a water catchment, it's adding to the atmosphere and not doing a lot, but if it's transpiring out of a plant as part of a photosynthetic process, increasing the fertility and soil carbon and water storage capacity of your soil. So you're looking at two elements of the same thing and to some extent, but one's creating a much greater net effect, I suppose. Fertility and infiltration are entwined. And what I mean by that is here's a sort of a shot of some of the clovers that I broadcast and trampled them in with sheep early in the last autumn. So a bit of diversity to that. And this is one of the reasons I destocked, because I had a crap load of feed setting seed on my top paddock. I had the decision to either look at utilising that feed for my sheep on a short-term purpose or reducing pressure and enabling that to set seed and build a greater seed bank for the future, and also enable the greater biomass trying to infiltrate water on top of the hillside. So I think that's the important thing. It takes more than carbon to make humus. It's a matter of there's a fertility that's involved. So there's different elements to things. So that's where there's an alignment with different people's conversations about how the more you can increase your soil, the more you increase your water holding capacity on your property. So that aligns also with avoiding monocultures. I'm strongly against strong growth grasses. We're trying to encourage something with a bit of diversity. We're doing a lot of trials at the moment about moving towards a winter-focused growth, perennial and self-regenerating type clovers and legumes particularly, different herbages and grasses that are going to enable us to utilise better the winter seasons that are much more guaranteed rainfall than the summer seasons we have. So, and that will enable us to, as Al mentioned earlier, filling those identified feed gaps of winter and early spring. Pretty well me as a general cover, but yeah, just to leave you on a note, it doesn't matter how much rain you receive if it never enters your soil. So take that focus into soil and infiltration, I suppose, as far as your landscape as a whole goes.